Boys and girls, it's time to move on to Chapter 9. I'm going to do my best to infuse both Chapter 8 and 9 together, but I got to do this quickly. So here it goes. We know that John Adams was our second president of the United States. He was a Federalist. What was that? That's right, he was a Federalist. Thomas Jefferson was the other guy that formed the opposite political party, which would be the Democratic Republicans. He would soon take power because he would win the next election. Here's some details about the election of 1800 that I'd like you to know. First, who were the Federalists that were running in that presidential election? They were John Adams and Charles Pinckney. We see John Adams right here. Might want to put a J.A. up here. The Republicans were Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. We see them right up here. So as you can kind of see already from the picture here, we see that Adams and Burr are standing taller than Jefferson. So we can assume that Jefferson is the winner or Burr. Moving right along, though. Campaigning back then was much different than the Trump-Clinton debates and campaigns of the 2016 presidential election. Here are two ways they were different. First, there were no planes, trains, automobiles, and all that stuff. So there's no flying around giving speeches in these marvelous convention centers like we have down in Oshkosh or up in Green Bay or the Kohl Center, things like that. It was strictly, everything was done by hand, handwriting, right? So the freedom of speech in the press was extremely important. And the other thing to note is that these candidates, Jefferson, Burr, and Adams, they all were very good at mudslinging. Mudslinging is a term you must know. It's writing letters that attack a person's character. Okay? So this was very popular back then, just like it is still today. Only today's candidates use radio and TV and Twitter and all that to degrade a person that they're running against. Political parties were charging each other with crimes or misdoings or wrongdoings, if you will. The Federalists were being charged with building a monarchy by the Democratic Republicans. Okay? So imagine we just broke away from Great Britain. Being a king is the last thing you wanted to be associated with. This is the equivalent of the deepest insult you could think of today on the Federalist. The Federalists charged the Democratic Republicans with being free-spirited or being godless. Now, 200 years ago, religion was way more a larger part of people's lives. So to be considered godless is, again, one of the deepest insults that you could call somebody even today. And keep in mind, 200 years ago, there were duels where people literally faced off against each other with armed swords and armed weapons to the death. And your honor, your character was all that you had. So some of these things could eventually lead to your death by duel if you weren't careful. So you didn't attack people's characters, like people do today, calling people a booger face. Today it's 2019. All you do is you get a shoulder rub and just don't do that again kind of a thing. But back then, calling somebody a coward or yellow or a booger face back then, that could lead to a challenge to the death. So these weren't things to take lightly. All right, the election is very unique, and this is something you could do in your project if you choose. It was a deadlock, which means there was an eventual tie. So Jefferson and Burr each get 73 votes, okay? So that's why up at the top of the podium here, they each get 73. I would write 73 above each of those right now. I'll do it for you. Okay, so we got 73 for Burr, 73 for Adams, and sorry, John Adams, you only get 65. Okay? So, not good. Adams is not going to be happy about that. He's hot-headed, remember? Moving on. The second point there, part B, is that the House of Representatives, they break a tie. The unique thing here is that 35 times the House was given a chance to vote and break the tie, and it still ended in a tie. So how did this happen? We got to understand that down here in the bottom, you don't have this, but it's okay. The election of 1800 looked like this. We had our 5 candidates up for president, 1, 2, 3 of them. And then we had a couple for vice president, down here in the bottom. So everybody got votes. Everybody voted twice. And what ended up happening is people that were intended to be the vice president ended up getting presidential votes. So that's what caused this great big mess. So how did it happen? Write these things down. Voting for president and vice president was all done on the same ballot. All right. So what that did is the person with the most votes would become president. Person with the second most votes would become vice president. So up here on the top, poor old Adams, he's left out. He's not vice president. He's not president. 12th Amendment would fix that. We got our little voting box here to help us remember that it has to deal with voting. What it did was it put president and vice president on separate ballots. Remember that? Separate ballots. So the new look would be like this. Again, you don't have to write this down. It's just a visual to show you. You'd have 3 people to vote for president and 2 to vote for vice president. Okay? So that means only 3 people would get a vote for president versus 5. And 2 people would get a vote for vice president, which is 2. So this is better. It would end up causing fewer ties. Okay? Again, pause the video if I'm going too fast. We need to move on to the third point. On the inside of the page, we know now that Jefferson wins. He breaks the tie in the House. He's finally voted in. A term you got to know about Jefferson's policies is laissez-faire. Say that, laissez-faire. Laissez-faire means to let the people do as they choose. This is a very 2019 millennial attitude, right? Kick back, do what you want, don't do your homework, play Fortnite, Battlefield, whatever it is you're into. Okay? Do what you want. Jefferson, he also favored westward expansion, growth of farms. So since he was highly agricultural, he needed to expand the size of the farms in order to help America grow agriculturally. Makes sense. He wanted to reduce the size of government. How would he do this? Shrink the military. Mainly, he wanted to shrink the army size, shrink the navy size. Think about doing this, what it would mean to your defense department, right? Shrinking the size of it. Could it be a greater risk of attack in the future? Possibly. But Jefferson was about spending less money, letting the people do what they want, reducing the size of the military. He also allowed those dreaded Alien and Sedition Acts and the Naturalization Act to expire or repeal. So that is good. That's making immigrants feel more welcome and more part of America. So that's a good thing. So Jefferson, on a whole, his policies shrunk the size of government, less spending. Good thing for some. John Adams wouldn't give up without a fight, though. Okay? We've heard of the story Marbury versus Madison, so here's my final point as quickly as I can. Federalists passed a law. They called it the Judiciary Act of 1801. This did a few things we got to know about. Number 1, we see in the picture down here, the midnight judges. John Adams, I lost. I'm not happy about it, but I can do something. I can make life for you miserable in passing your laws. I can put Federalists, my midnight judges, into these new positions to intercept your laws and declare them unconstitutional. So that was his hope. And he succeeds in large part in doing that. So he tries to stop Jefferson's laws from passing in Congress. Problem is, John Marshall becomes Chief Justice. He is a Federalist. You'd think this is good, but it's not good. He ends up ruling against John Adams in his plan. What is the result of this midnight judges and the Judiciary Act? It ensures that the Federalists control the courts. Again, the hope is to block or stop Thomas Jefferson's laws from becoming a reality. Moving on to point 5. All right, so our last point here is about Marbury versus Madison. I got to be quick. First one, Jefferson ends up intercepting some of these notes, these appointments, before the Federalists are all in their judge positions, and he denies William Marbury, who's a Federalist, his position as a judge. Marbury is furious. He's livid. He takes it to the Supreme Court, thinking that the Supreme Court can help issue a writ, which is basically a law, giving him his position. But he's wrong. John Marshall and the Supreme Court, write this in, decides that Marbury doesn't get his position. He decides this on 2 parts, and they're the bottom 2 here. All right? He says the Constitution is the law of the land. Extremely important, write that in. And he says, because I cannot find that I can give you this power as a judge in the Constitution, I can't do it. It conflicts with the Constitution, actually. So point 3, always follow the Constitution in times of conflict.